For almost the whole of human history, there's a number that does not change. About 5 kilometers an hour, 30 or 40 kilometers in a hard day. That is walking pace, and for tens of thousands of years, it is the top speed of absolutely everything. It is the speed of goods. It is the speed of an army. It is the speed of a rumor, a warning, an order, and a piece of news. And that number is a ceiling on how large anything can be. An empire cannot be bigger than the distance across which somebody can be told what to do and reply. A market cannot be bigger than the distance a decision can travel before it stops being relevant. So the interesting question is not which animals people tamed. It is which one moved that number. And the answer is exactly one animal. Not the dog, which gave us a hunting partner and a friend and no extra speed at all. Not cattle, which gave meat and milk and pulling power at the pace of a slow walk. Not the sheep, the goat, the pig, the chicken, or the cat. The horse. And this episode is about how badly we got the story wrong and how recently it was fixed. Start with why the horse is a hard problem, both to tame and to find. Taming it is hard because a horse is built entirely around running away. It is a flight animal with enormous power. It panics as a first response, and a frightened horse can kill a person without meaning to. And an untrained horse is not useful for anything except meat. A sheep is useful the moment you own it. A horse is useful only after somebody has spent months on it. There's also a size problem that nobody mentions. Ancient horses were small. The animals in these stories are roughly pony-sized. The large horse that can carry an armored adult all day is a very late piece of breeding. Finding in the archaeology is harder still, and this is the part people underestimate. When you domesticate a sheep or a goat, the animal changes shape quickly. It gets smaller, the horns change, and you can see it in the bones within a few centuries. Horses barely do this. A wild horse skeleton and an early domestic horse skeleton look very nearly the same. So the field had to find indirect signals, and it found 4. The first is bit wear. A bit sits in the gap between the front teeth and the back teeth, and a horse that mouths, it wears a distinctive bevel on the front edge of the lower second premolar. The second is pathology. Carrying a rider and being ridden hard leaves marks on the spine and the ribs. The third is the shape of the herd. Hunters kill whatever they can catch, so you get a spread of ages. Herders cull surplus young males and keep the mares, so the age and sex profile of the bones changes. And the fourth is chemistry. Fat residues soak into cooking pots, and horse milk fat is distinguishable from horse meat fat. That last one is worth a moment, because mare's milk is a serious food in its own right and still is across Central Asia. Fermented into kumis, it keeps, it travels, and it turns an animal you cannot eat twice into one that feeds you every day. Which brings us to the site that everybody was taught, and that turned out to be the wrong answer to the right question. Botai in northern Kazakhstan, around 3,500 years before the Common Era. The faunal assemblage there is staggering. Over 90% of the animal bone on the site is horse. These people were living almost entirely on horses. There are lines of post holes that look like corrals, and the soil inside them carries the chemical signature of accumulated dung. David Anthony and Dorcas Brown examined the teeth and reported bit wear. And in 2009, a team led by Alan Outram published the residue analysis. The pottery from Botai carries the lipid signature of mare's milk. That last one felt conclusive, and for a very good reason. You cannot walk up to a wild horse and milk it. Milking requires an animal that tolerates being handled daily, and a mare that will let you near her foal. So Botai went into every textbook as the place where the horse was domesticated, and it stayed there for nearly a decade. Then, in 2018, a team led by Charlene Gonitz sequenced the genomes of the Botai horses. And the result was not what anybody expected. The Botai horses are the ancestors of Przewalski's horse. Przewalski's horse is the animal that had been described for a century as the last truly wild horse on Earth, the one that was never tamed. It is not. It is the feral descendant of the Botai animals, which means the last wild horse is an escaped domestic one. And the second half of the result is worse for the textbooks. The Botai horses are not the ancestors of modern domestic horses. That lineage comes from somewhere else entirely. So the Botai people did domesticate the horse. They just did not domesticate the horse that everybody afterwards rode. It is a rare and rather beautiful kind of finding because it confirms and demolishes the same claim at the same time. And it is worth saying that the argument is not over. The bit where evidence has been challenged, and whether Botai horses were ridden or simply pinned and milked is still discussed. So where does the horse we actually use come from? The answer arrived in 2021 from a very large piece of work led by Ludovic Orlando and Pablo Labrado. They sequenced hundreds of ancient horse genomes from across Eurasia, spanning thousands of years, and then looked for where the modern lineage first appears. It appears in the western Eurasian steppe, in the region of the Lower Volga and the Don, around 2,200 years before the Common Era. Geneticists call that lineage DOM2, and what it does next is the striking part. Within a few centuries, it spreads across Eurasia and replaces almost every other horse lineage in its path. That is not gradual adoption. That is one kind of horse arriving everywhere and other horses ceasing to exist. And the genomes suggest why, because two genes stand out as having been under strong selection. One is associated with the strength and robustness of the back. The other is associated with docility and reduced anxiety, which is a rather blunt summary of what a person wants from a horse. Carry weight without breaking, and do not panic. So the animal that conquered Eurasia was not simply found. It was built quite fast by people selecting for exactly those two things. And the thing that arrives with it is not a saddle. It is a wheel. At Sintashta, in the southern Urals, graves from around 2,000 years before the Common Era contain the earliest known spoke-wheeled chariots. A chariot is what you build when you have horses that are too small to carry a man in armor, but perfectly able to pull one. So the first great horse weapon is not cavalry. It is a cart with a driver and an archer on it. It dominates warfare for centuries. There's one more thread here, and it is genuinely unresolved, so it is worth flagging rather than smoothing over. Riding may be older than DOM2. In 2023, a team including Martin Trotman reported a set of skeletal changes in Yamnaya individuals from around 3,000 years before the Common Era. Worn hip sockets, altered thigh bones, and stress in the lower spine, forming a pattern sometimes called horseman syndrome. If that reading is right, people were riding horses several centuries before the lineage we now ride even existed. It is contested because those skeletal changes have other possible causes, but it is a live and serious argument. Now leave the origin question and ask the more useful one. What does having horses actually do? And before the answer, one detail that surprises almost everybody. For most of this story, riders had no stirrups. The stirrup is a late invention, arriving in the West only in the first millennium of the Common Era, which means that for 2,000 years people rode gripping with their legs. You could do a great deal like that, including shoot a bow. What you cannot easily do is brace against an impact, which is why the heavily armored charging rider is a very late development. Start with the honest limits, because horses are not magic. A horse eats a great deal, and it needs grazing, water, and care. It is expensive. For plowing, it was long outperformed by the ox, and not because oxen are faster. They are not. It is because the harness was wrong. An early harness runs across the animal's windpipe, so a pulling horse partly strangles itself. The collar that fixes this is a medieval invention, which is why oxen kept pulling plows for thousands of years after horses were available. But there is one thing a horse does that nothing else does, and it is the whole of this episode. It converts grass into distance. Grass is a resource human beings cannot use. We cannot digest it, and we cannot store it, and enormous parts of the world are made of almost nothing else. A horse eats the grass and gives back speed and range across exactly the landscape where nothing else is available. Which is why this animal transforms the steppe specifically, and why the steppe stops being an empty edge of the map and becomes a corridor running most of the way across a continent. And it changes the geometry of conflict. In the episode on war, we argued that the oldest defensive technology is the ability to leave. A horse hands that same property to the attacker, and it does it at 3 times the speed. A raid can now come from somewhere you are not watching and be gone before anybody can gather. Now, the twist, and it comes back to the number this episode opened with. Almost every technology this series has looked at moves matter. Containers move food. Boats move people. Sledges move stone. The horse is the first one that moves an idea faster than a person can walk. And it does something even more important than being fast, which is that it can be relayed. A horse tires, but if there is a fresh horse waiting at the next station, the message does not tire, and it keeps going at speed all day and all night. That is not a vehicle. That is a network, and it is the first one. And people built exactly that as soon as they could afford it. The Persian royal road ran relay stations with fresh horses and fresh riders, and Herodotus wrote an admiring line about them that ended up carved on a post office in New York. The Mongol relay system did the same thing across a far larger area, with stations roughly a day apart, all the way across Asia. Neither of those is a transport system, exactly. They are both a wire, made out of animals. So the horse quietly sets the maximum size of anything that has to be coordinated. An empire, an army, a trading system, a religion with instructions in it. And here is the part that is genuinely strange when you look at it directly. That limit then barely moves for about 4,000 years. The fastest that anybody could send a sentence in a year, 1800, was, give or take, the speed at which somebody could send a sentence in 1800 before the Common Era. Faster roads, better saddles, better breeding, better organization, all of it, and the underlying number is still a horse. It only breaks in the 1840s, with wires and electricity, and it breaks so completely that we have almost forgotten there was ever a limit. That is the real discontinuity, and it is about a century and a half old. Which is why it is a mistake to file the horse with cattle and sheep as livestock. Cattle changed what people ate. Sheep changed what people wore. Those are enormous changes, and they are changes of the same kind as everything else in this series. The horse changed how far away a decision could be made and still be obeyed. For 4,000 years, the size of a known world was simply this: the distance a horse could carry a sentence in a day, multiplied by how many horses you could afford.